The beam is cool beneath your palm, even though the room has been breathing warm, damp air since before dawn, and the linen wound around it holds the night inside its folds, like a quiet thing not yet ready to leave. You stand close enough to smell the starch, faintly sour and floury, with a wet, clean scent underneath it, and you listen to the slow wooden settling of the beetling room before the day's work begins in earnest. The windows are grey with cork morning, not bright yet, only a softened square of pale light above the sill, and beyond the wall the mill stream moves with a low, steady patience that seems older than the building itself. Your boots know the worn boards by memory, where the grain has been polished by years of careful passing, and where a little hollow near the first machine collects the dust that falls from dry cloth and old timber. The beetles hang above the roll, heavy wooden hammers with blunt faces, each one waiting its turn as if asleep, while the shaft overhead rests with its iron pins and smooth dark marks where motion has rubbed the wood to a gloss. In a little while, when the water is given to the wheel and the belt begins its mild trembling journey, those hammers will rise and fall and rise again, not angrily, not hurriedly, but with the plain insistence of work that has been done this way for generations. You are a linen beetler, though it's not the sort of name that explains itself to anyone outside the mill, and even in the town some people only know that you work with cloth after it has already been woven. The weavers have had their rhythm, the bleachers their weather, the dressers their brushes and sizing, and now the linen comes to you in long damp lengths, ready for the final persuasion of weight, time, and repetition. Your part is not to create the thread or pattern, but to settle the fabric into itself, pressing the weave closer, flattening the tiny ridges, and coaxing out the quiet sheen that makes good linen catch the light like calm water. There is no sudden beginning to this work, only a sequence of small readinesses, the kind your hands can follow while the rest of you remains still and listening. You check the roll first, leaning in to see whether the cloth sits evenly around the beam, because a wrinkle hidden at the start can become a fault after hours of pounding, and a fault in linen is not loud, but it's stubborn. You run your fingers along the edge, feeling for a loose fold or a raised seam, and the cloth gives back a cold dampness that darkens your fingertips before slowly fading into the skin. The linen has already been steeped in starch, often potato starch, mixed and thinned until it can pass into the cloth without leaving lumps, because the beetling works best when the fibers are damp, weighted, and ready to dry under pressure. It arrives not as a delicate household cloth, not yet, but as work in progress, wound and rewound, handled by men and women whose names may never travel with it beyond Cork, though their touch remains in every yard. The starch helps the surface take a finish, and as the hammers fall over hours and days, the linen becomes flatter, closer, and more lustrous, as though the cloth has been taught to lie still. When the mill is fully awake, it doesn't roar so much as surround you, with the wheel turning outside, the gearing answering inside, and the beetles beginning their measured knocking on the linen beam. The sound is large at first, too large for thought, but after a while it breaks into layers, one hammer dropping a fraction before another, one bearing creaking softly, one belt slapping with a tired leather murmur. You learn to hear the difference between ordinary noise and useful warning, because a beetler must notice when a knock changes pitch, when a strap runs out of line, or when the cloth below begins to shift from its proper place. In the 1910s, there are mills in Ireland where linen work is vast and crowded, especially farther north. But here in Cork, the trade feels more mixed into other kinds of labour, beside flour, butter, wool, malt, carts, river traffic, and the many ordinary industries of a city and county that have always known water and work. A beetling room here may not be the largest place in Irish linen, yet it still belongs to that older island skill, the turning of flax into thread, and thread into cloth, and cloth into something finer than its first weaving. You don't think of it in such broad words during the morning, because your job is narrower and more faithful than that. You think, instead of the roll in front of you, and the way the damp cloth should feel when it has taken enough of the hammering, not soft like worn linen from a drawer, but smooth and compact, with a firmness that tells you the fibers have settled. You turn the beam by degrees as the work requires, bringing new surfaces under the beetles, and you keep the pressure even, because the sheen is not painted on but made by thousands upon thousands of careful impacts, each one too small to matter alone and unmistakable when gathered together. That is the quiet secret of beetling, and perhaps of many lives around mills and workshops. The hammers themselves are sometimes called beetles, a word that feels old in the mouth, plain and wooden, and they are shaped for endurance rather than beauty. Their faces are broad and blunt, often made from hard timber, and their handles or stocks are lifted by the turning wipers on the shaft, so that each hammer rises, pauses for a breath, and drops onto the cloth-wrapped beam with its own weight. You oil what must be oiled, tighten what must be tightened, and keep dust away from places where dust becomes trouble, while the machine performs its patient argument with the linen. There is skill in knowing when not to interfere, and much of your day is spent standing near enough to be responsible, but far enough to let the motion continue without needless fussing. You watch the cloth edge, the belt, the hammer faces, the slow creep of drying through the roll, and you listen with the listening of someone who has learned that machines speak most clearly in small changes. If a stranger came through, he might hear only pounding and think the work simple. But you know the room is full of signals, some in the air, some underfoot, some felt through the wood when you rest your palm against the frame. By mid-morning, the dampness lifts from the linen and gathers in the room, and the windows grow blurred at the corners where warmth meets cold glass. Your shirt clings a little beneath your waistcoat, though your hands stay chilled from the wet cloth, and there is a line of dust at your cuff where dry lint has found the starch and stayed there. Somewhere near the door, a mug of tea cools beside a folded heel of bread, and though you may only take a few bites between tasks, the taste of it is steady and familiar. Work like this doesn't leave much space for ceremony, but it gives its own small comforts. Outside, Cork moves into its day with carts on stone, voices at shop fronts, and the softer passing of people who know the mill by sound before they see its walls. The river and its smaller waters have carried so many kinds of work through the county, turning wheels, floating goods, washing cloth, and giving shape to trades that depend on the gentle force of moving water. Inside, your world has narrowed to timber, linen, leather, iron, starch, and the repeated fall of beetles, and there is something restful in that narrowing, as though the morning has placed everything unnecessary beyond the threshold. You have only to attend to what is here. The linen on the beam may have begun as flax growing in a field, a plant with a blue flower so brief and pale that it seems almost too delicate to become cloth. It was pulled, retted, dried, broken, scutched, hackled, spun, woven, bleached, washed, and carried onward through hands that understood each stage, until at last it came into this room for finishing. By the time it reaches you, the softness of the flower has become strength, and the thread has become fabric, but the beetling gives it a final settling, a polished density that people will later notice without knowing why they notice it. There are cloths meant for shirts, cloths meant for collars, cloths meant for table linen, cloths that will be cut and sewn and washed and folded for years. Some will go to households that keep their best pieces wrapped away, brought out for visitors or feast days, while others will become plainer goods, used hard and washed often, softening with work. You do not know where each length will end, and perhaps that is just as well, because your duty is not to imagine every table or cupboard, but to give the linen its finish. A good finish is a quiet promise made before the cloth leaves the mill. As the hours pass, the first harshness of the sound disappears from your mind, and the beetling becomes almost like weather, steady enough to lean against. The wooden hammers rise and fall, and between their beats you hear little things, a cartwheel outside, the call of someone in another room, the small squeak of a pulley that will need a drop of oil before dinner. Your body settles into the timing, stepping in when the machine allows, waiting when it doesn't, and moving with the cautious ease of someone who knows that patience is part of the tool set. There is no need to rush the cloth, because linen keeps its own time, and the old process respects that more than many newer machines do. Beetling can take many hours, sometimes days for particular finishes, because the point is not merely to strike the fabric, but to let moisture, starch, pressure, and drying work together slowly. You learn that some changes cannot be hurried without losing the very quality you're trying to bring forward. And this lesson sits quietly in the room, carried by the beam, the hammers, and the softened shine beginning to appear on the linen surface. When you stop the machine for checking, the silence feels at first like a door opening onto another world, though the water still moves outside and the building still ticks with old warmth. You lean close to the roll, lift a loose edge if there is one to inspect, and smooth it back with the side of your hand, careful not to pull the cloth out of its winding. In that pause, the smell of wet linen becomes clearer, earthy and clean, a little like laundry brought in before rain, and the whole room seems to breathe around the stillness. Then the gearing takes up again, and the rhythm returns. There are other workers in and out of the building, and though everyone has a different duty, the mill gathers people into one shared clock made of water, belts, whistles, and meal breaks. Someone from the finishing side brings word of a length that must be watched carefully, because the customer wants a particularly smooth face, and someone else passes with an armful of folded cloth, moving quickly but not hurriedly. You exchange the ordinary remarks of working people about weather, bread, wages, a cousin gone to Queenstown, a child with a cough, and then you return to the beam, because the machine's voice has shifted slightly. That small shift may be nothing more than a belt drying as the room warms, or a hammer face landing differently, because the roll has settled under it. You test with your eyes first, then your hand when it is safe, and you find that the cloth is lying well, though one edge needs attention before it becomes troublesome. The work is practical and modest, made of these tiny preventions, these adjustments no one outside the room will ever see, and much of a beetler's pride comes from faults that never happen because he was watchful. A smooth length leaving the mill carries hidden care in every inch. By dinner time, the building has changed its smell, and the sharper morning damp has softened into warm starch, oiled metal, old wood, and the faint human scent of coats hung near the door. You sit where you can still see the machines, because rest in a mill is often taken beside the thing you're resting from, and your food is simple enough to be eaten with one hand if needed. Bread, butter, perhaps cold potato, perhaps tea from a tin can, perhaps a bit of meat, if the week has allowed it, and every bite is made more welcome by the steady labor of the morning. The hammers, stopped or slowed, seem to wait with you. In the 1910s, the world beyond the mill is changing quickly, though inside this room change arrives more slowly, in repairs, new belts, altered orders, and talk carried in from newspapers and railway stations. There are motor cars sometimes where horses used to be, electric light in places that once kept lamps, and beyond Ireland there are tensions and movements that working people hear about in pieces, usually while their hands continue doing what must be done. Yet the beetling room keeps a longer memory because the method belongs to an earlier century and still remains useful, still making cloth in the old manner. That can be a comfort. You may not think of yourself as preserving anything grand, because a wage earner seldom has the luxury of naming his labor in such polished terms. You come because there is work to be done, because rent is due, because food must be bought, because the cloth must be finished and the machines must be tended. Still, there is dignity in the steadiness of it, in knowing how a damp length should be wound, how a hammer should sound, how starch behaves in cold weather, and how linen changes under pressure. These are not abstract skills, but knowledge stored in the hands. After the meal, the afternoon lies longer and quieter, though the machines may be as loud as before, because the mind grows used to their company and begins to drift inside the rhythm. Light strengthens at the windows, showing the floating lint more clearly, each small fibre crossing the air like a pale thread cut loose from the cloth. The beam turns, the beetles fall, and the linen takes on that compact, smooth quality which the trade values, while you pass through the same motions again, checking, listening, touching, adjusting, and waiting with care. The day is not empty because it repeats. It is full because it repeats well. Sometimes a length of cloth has to be unwound, examined, and rewound, and this is where the work becomes more bodily, with shoulders, wrists, and back all joining the judgment of the eye. Linen has weight when damp, more than people expect from something that will later lie so lightly over a table or fold so neatly in a drawer. You and another worker guide it together, keeping it even, avoiding creases, speaking only when needed, because the cloth itself commands a kind of quiet. It passes over your hands cool and smooth, and each yard asks to be treated the same as the last. The beam is not a small thing, and the winding must be firm but not careless, because beetling works through evenness as much as force. If the roll is slack, the hammering will not carry properly through the layers, and if it is wound with hidden folds, the finish will betray the mistake later under light. So you take your time, guiding the selvage, feeling the tension, watching the line of cloth build around the wood, and trusting the slow agreement between hand and eye. The machine can pound for hours, but the first careful winding remains essential, though no customer will ever see that moment. There are marks of earlier workers everywhere, not written plainly like names in a book, but left in smoothed handles, mended boards, patched belts, and tools hung where generations of hands found them convenient. A wedge rests on a ledge near the frame because someone long ago decided that was where it belonged, and now everyone agrees without ever saying so. The beetling room is made of such agreements, practical, quiet, inherited, and softened by use, and when you reach for a thing in its usual place, you are touching a small piece of continuity. Workplaces remember through arrangement. In winter, the room can be cold at the edges, even with the damp warmth rising from cloth and motion, and your breath may show briefly before the machinery has fully woken. In summer, the same room becomes close and heavy, with windows opened when they can be, and the smell of the stream mixing with starch and warm timber. The job changes with weather more than with the calendar, because linen absorbs the air around it, and drying is never separate from the day itself. A good beetler notices whether the morning is dry, wet, harsh, or mild, and adjusts his expectations accordingly. The hammers do not strike bare cloth directly laid flat, as a person might imagine, but beat upon the linen wound round the beam, so the pressure travels through layers and gradually compacts the fabric. This is why the work has a deep patience in it, because the finish is built by repetition rather than by one strong blow. The wooden beetles are lifted by the turning shaft, their rise governed by the shape and spacing of the wipers, and then gravity gives each hammer back to the roll, with a sound that becomes part of your breathing. It is simple in principle, but exact in practice. There are machines newer and faster in the textile world by the 1910s, and there are chemical finishes and pressing methods that can imitate certain effects. But beetled linen has its own character. The sheen is not slick or glassy, but quiet, lying inside the surface rather than on top of it, and the cloth feels fuller because the weave has been tightened by impact and drying. When you handle a finished piece, you can sense the difference before anyone explains it, the way the fabric folds with a controlled softness and reflects light along its threads. That is what the long pounding has been for. A visitor might ask whether the sound troubles you, and you might have to think before answering, because after years in the room, the noise has become less like noise and more like place. It is there when you arrive, there while you work, there when you think about home. And when the machine stops at day's end, the absence of it rings for a while in your ears. Even in bed some nights, the rhythm may continue faintly in memory, not unpleasantly, but like a tide that has followed you inland. The body keeps the measure of labor. In the late afternoon, the light begins to lower, and the windows lose their clear grey shine, becoming duller patches set into the wall. The machines still move, but the day's work has a different feel now, as if everyone in the mill has become more careful with words and gestures, conserving strength without neglecting duty. You check the cloth again, and where the linen has dried under the beetles, the surface seems smoother beneath your fingers, with the faint cool slip of a good finish beginning to appear. It is a small satisfaction, but a real one. You think, perhaps, of the people who will never know this room yet will live with its work, smoothing a cloth over a table, buttoning a shirt, cutting a pattern, folding linen into a press. They may praise the weave, the whiteness, the quality, or they may say nothing at all, simply using the fabric because it does what good linen is meant to do. That silence is not failure, because many kinds of good work are meant to disappear into daily life, becoming ordinary enough to be trusted. A beetler's labor often ends as usefulness, and usefulness has its own soft honor. Before the final stopping, there is still tidying to do, because a mill left carelessly at night makes a poorer morning. You clear loose lint, look to the belts, settle tools back into their places, and make sure no damp cloth has been left where it might sour or crease before anyone returns. The last turns of the shaft slow in stages, and the beetles drop once, twice, then rest, their heavy faces near the roll like workmen sitting down after a long day. The room seems larger when the pounding ends, and every small sound comes forward with gentleness. Now the stream outside is easier to hear, and with the wheel slowed or stopped, the water speaks in its own low voice against stone and bank. Evening gathers in the corners of the beetling room, not suddenly, but as a deepening of all the shadows that have been waiting behind beams, shelves, and doorways. You touch the linen once more, not because it needs touching, but because the habit of care remains in the hand even after the task is done, and the cloth gives back its cool, smooth. It has been changed by the day's patience, and so, in a quieter way, have you. The cloth is not finished in a single day merely because the room has gone quiet, and that is one of the first lessons the work teaches without ever naming itself. Linen keeps taking shape after the obvious labor has paused, while dampness settles deeper into the roll and the starch finds its place among the fibers. In the morning, when you come back through the same door and smell the old mixture of water, wood, and thread, you're meeting yesterday's effort again, softened by the night and ready for another passage under the beetles. There is comfort in returning to a thing that has not gone wandering while you slept, because the beam remains where it was, the hammers hang where they were lifted, and the room holds the patient memory of the previous shift. You set your coat aside, rub warmth into your hands, and look over the linen before motion begins, noticing whether the edge has held true and whether the roll has settled evenly on its core. The first touch tells you much, and though no one would call it reading, that is partly what it is, a quiet reading of cloth by finger and palm. In Cork, a morning could come in from the river with a dampness that seemed to gather in stone walls and wool sleeves alike, and a beetler learned to work with that damp rather than complain of it. Too dry a day could make the finish less forgiving, while too wet a day lengthened the waiting, and so the weather became another unseen tool lying beside the hammer and beam. You might glance at the window and know something about the linen before touching it, because the glass, the air, and the smell of the room were all speaking the same language. The flax fiber itself has a plain kind of stubbornness, stronger than cotton in many uses, and smoother when properly finished, but it does not become graceful by accident. Each fiber is long and fine, held together in the stem by natural gums that earlier workers have loosened through retting and preparation, and by the time it reaches the finishing room, the thread still remembers both plant and process. Beetling does not erase that memory so much as organize it, pressing the woven yarns flatter, closing their spaces, and helping the surface take on a luster that feels earned. When the hammers begin again, the first blows seem to knock the sleep from the room, yet they do it without haste, because the shaft turns as steadily as water permits. You stand near the side of the frame and watch the falling sequence, each wooden head striking in its appointed place, while the roll underneath receives the pressure through its layers. There is an old fairness in that motion, a sense that each part of the cloth will have its turn, and if you keep the winding true, the finish will come across the whole length with evenness. The word beetling may make a person think of an insect, small and glossy-backed, but here it belongs to older tools, to wooden mallets and heavy beaters used before machinery took over the lifting. In earlier times, cloth could be pounded by hand or in simpler water-driven stocks, and the mechanized beetling engine kept the old principle while sparing some of the hardest repetitive motion. Still, the machine did not remove the worker, because every repeated act needed a human watcher, and every smooth result depended on someone nearby who understood the pace of wood against linen. You do not stand idle while the machine works, though from a distance the task might seem like waiting beside noise. You inspect one beam while another is running, fetch starch or speak with a finisher, trim a loose thread when needed, and keep the walkways clear of fibers and small scraps that could catch where they do not belong. The room has its own housekeeping, and in such places cleanliness is not a shining domestic thing but a practical order, the kind that keeps work safe, cloth clean, and tools obedient. A beetling engine is simple enough to be understood by watching, and complicated enough to keep a careful man humble. The main shaft turns, the cams or wipers lift the hammer tails, gravity brings the heads down, and the cloth-wrapped roller slowly presents new surfaces beneath that falling weight. If the machine is driven by water, then the outside world enters through speed and force, because rain in the hills, drought in summer, and the condition of the race can all influence the steadiness of the day's motion. There are times when the sound changes because the water changes, and the whole room seems to lean with it, as if listening to the mill stream's mood. You may not see the wheel from where you stand, but you feel it through the belts and hear it in the slight lengthening of the beat when power falls away. Then someone must go to the sluice, or to the wheelhouse, or simply wait while a condition settles, because the mill is not separate from water, but attached to it like a branch to a tree. The cloth, meanwhile, waits better than people do, wound tight enough to hold itself, but not so tight that it loses breath. You smooth the exposed edge again, and the linen has a faint chill that seems to belong not merely to dampness, but to the plant's long history in wet fields and washing water. It is a useful illusion, perhaps, but work often gives people such private understandings, and no harm is done if a beetler feels that linen carries a little of the weather inside it. On some mornings, the cloth comes from the bleaching green with a brightness that looks almost blue in weak light, and on others it carries the creamier tone of linen not yet fully whitened. Bleaching had its own slow science, once tied closely to sun, grass, water, alkali and repeated wetting, though by the 1910s chemical methods had long altered the pace and scale of the trade. Still, the beetler sees the cloth after those earlier treatments have done their part, and he knows that brightness alone is not finish, because whiteness may please the eye while the hand still asks for smoothness. You feel the difference between a cloth that is simply dry and one that has been properly beetled, because the latter lies closer to itself, as though its weave has stopped fidgeting. The threads no longer stand apart in the same way, and the surface reflects light softly across its face, not from varnish or trick, but from the flattened arrangement of yarn and fiber. If you bend a finished piece near the window, the light travels along it in a quiet line, and the sight brings a restrained kind of pride. Much of the job is this restrained pride, never loud enough to be spoken of for long, but present in small nods, in a length accepted without complaint, and in the absence of faults during inspection. A foreman may say little when the cloth is right, because rightness is expected, and yet the worker knows when he has carried the day well. There is a steadiness that comes from doing a task so exact that praise is usually replaced by continued trust, and trust, in a mill, can be a deeply practical form of respect. The 1910s are not gentle years for every worker, and wages, hours, and uncertainty press on people as surely as any beam presses cloth. Yet, within the working day, there are rhythms that shelter the mind, not from hardship entirely, but from the constant need to invent what comes next. You arrive, prepare, listen, tend, pause, eat, resume, inspect, and clean. And those repeated shapes make a kind of frame around the hours, a frame sturdy enough to hold tiredness, without letting it spill everywhere. In the beetling room, talk comes and goes in pieces because the sound makes long conversation impractical, and because the cloth itself keeps asking for attention. A question is raised with a nod or a lifted hand, an answer is given by gesture, and jokes, when they pass, are simple and brief, folded into the work rather than made into performance. The companionship is not constant speech, but shared nearness, the knowledge that another person hears the same machines, smells the same starch, and understands why your eyes keep returning to the edge of the roll. Sometimes an older beetler shows a younger one how to judge the winding, not with a lecture, but by placing his hand on the cloth and then letting the younger hand follow. The lesson is in pressure, in the slight resistance of a good roll, in the tiny ridge that warns of trouble, and in the patience to stop early rather than repair late. These teachings do not look grand from the outside, yet they are how a trade survives, passing from one set of hands to another through touch, correction, and habit. The younger worker may begin by hearing only the hammering, all of it crowded together in one hard wooden sound, but after weeks he begins to separate it. He hears the difference between a hammer landing firmly and one landing deadened by an uneven roll, between a belt that is content and one that wants tightening, between ordinary vibration and a bearing starting to complain. By the time he can hear those things without trying, the room has become less foreign, and the machines have begun to include him in their routine. Your own ears may no longer notice the full strength of the noise until you step outside and feel the world widen around you. The street seems soft after the beetling room, even when cartwheels pass and gulls call down toward the quays, because the steady knocking has trained your hearing around a single center. For a few moments, the quiet beyond the door is almost as physical as the sound had been, resting against your face, and the afternoon air carries coal smoke, horse sweat, sea damp, and bread from somewhere nearby. Cork in that time is a working city of slopes, bridges, bells, yards, markets, and waterways. And every trade has its own smell tucked into the larger air. Butter has its clean, fat sweetness, malt has its warm grain, printer's ink has its dark oil, and the linen room carries starch and damp fiber, less obvious perhaps, but no less particular to those who know it. A man walking home from beetling may carry the day in his clothes, and at his own door someone might smell the mill before he has said a word. At home, the work does not need explaining every evening, because the household knows the broad facts of tired arms, damp cuffs, and the powdery trace of lint that appears where cloth has brushed sleeve or waistcoat. Supper may be simple and welcome, eaten slowly because the body is glad to sit, while talk turns to ordinary matters that have nothing to do with beans or beetles. Yet even there, when a clean cloth is laid or a shirt is folded, you may notice the finish before anyone else does, because the hand keeps its knowledge after the shift ends. The next day brings another length, or the same length turned to another stage, and the distinction between one workday and the next becomes less sharp than the difference between good and careless handling. If the order is for fine table linen, the care may be especially close, because any unevenness in sheen can show when the cloth is spread wide under lamplight. You imagine, not vividly, but gently, some household far from the mill where hands will smooth that surface for a meal, and though the picture passes quickly, it leaves a small warmth behind. Fine linen has always belonged both to labor and to ceremony, because it begins in fields and workshops, yet often ends in places where people want cleanliness, order, and occasion. The same cloth that takes mud, retting water, spinning, weaving, bleaching, and beetling may later be associated with weddings, christenings, hospital beds, hotel tables, or Sunday drawers. A beetler stands near the end of this long making, and though the task is mechanical, it touches all those later uses by giving the fabric its poise. The work is not delicate in the way embroidery is delicate, with needle and pattern, but it has a different delicacy hidden inside force. Wooden hammers can spoil as well as finish, and pressure applied unevenly can make faults that no amount of wishing will remove. So you treat heaviness carefully, which is one of the strange skills of the trade, and you learn that gentleness does not always mean lightness, because sometimes it means knowing how to use weight without violence. When the machine is running well, there is a kind of order in the falling hammers that can almost lull the mind, and many thoughts pass without needing to be held. You remember a message to carry home, a price at the shop, a repair needed on a boot, the face of someone you saw by the bridge, and then all of it fades back beneath the larger rhythm. The work permits such drifting only because the trained part of you remains awake, watching the roll and hearing the machine with a vigilance so practiced it feels nearly peaceful. At certain times, the cloth must be turned or shifted so another part receives the same treatment, and the change interrupts the rhythm without breaking the calm. The machine is stopped, the hammers hang, and you work with the beam, loosening, guiding, tightening again, while the silence fills with breath, footsteps, and the faint creak of timber under strain. It is during these pauses that the room seems most human, because the great repeated sound has withdrawn and left only people handling cloth with quiet concentration and care. A strip of linen slipping across the hand has a voice of its own, a dry whisper when it is aired, a deeper hush when still damp, and a faint scrape where starch stiffens the surface. You listen to that too, because a textile worker's world is made of more than sight, and cloth announces its condition in sound, weight, and drag. The best work comes when all senses agree, when the eye sees evenness, the hand feels it, and the ear accepts the soft passage of fabric as right. The starch room, if you pass through it, has another atmosphere again, warmer and more kitchen-like, with a boiled scent that might almost be homely if not for the industrial scale and the damp weight of cloth waiting nearby. Starch made from potatoes or other sources is mixed to a consistency that can enter the linen and help it take the beetled finish, giving body without clumsy stiffness when done well. Too much can make the cloth harsh or false, too little can leave it without the desired smoothness. And so, even this plain mixture asks for judgment. In a household, starch may belong to collars, cuffs, aprons, and careful ironing, but in the mill it becomes part of a larger finishing craft. It supports the fibers while hammering and drying compress the weave, and later, through washing and use, some of that temporary aid will change or depart, while the settled structure remains. The beetler does not need to speak in chemical terms to know this, because he sees how cloth behaves under different mixtures, how it stiffens, softens, dulls, or shines according to preparation and time. The linen trade is full of such practical sciences, learned before they were named in books, and carried by people whose experiments were made through seasons and orders rather than laboratories. They knew how flax should feel after retting, how yarn should hold twist, how woven cloth should respond to washing, and how beetling should be adjusted when the air was wet. Their knowledge lived in verbs: soak, pull, beat, rinse, dry, wind, smooth, and it was no less real for being spoken in the plain grammar of work. By afternoon, when your shoulders begin to feel the weight of repeated handling, the mind may grow tender around small comforts. A shaft of light on a clean stretch of floor, a cup of tea still warm enough to steam, a familiar step in the doorway, or the faint satisfaction of seeing a roll lie true can become enough. In steady labor, pleasure is often modest and exact, found not in escape from the task, but in the little signs that the task is proceeding as it should. The mill cat, if there is one, may appear near the sacks or along the wall where warmth gathers, keeping its own hours and caring little for the finish of linen. It has learned which machines to avoid and which corners are safe, and it moves through the room with the independence of a creature that belongs without being employed. Workers may spare it a glance or a crust, and then return to the beam, while the cat folds itself near a patch of weak sun and becomes another quiet part of the place. Outside, rain might begin softly enough that no one hears it at first, because the beetling covers the roof's first whispers, but soon the window glass grows darker and the air thickens. Rain in Cork does not always announce itself with force. Sometimes it simply joins what is already damp, making stone, wood, cloth, and coat seem more deeply themselves. The linen responds too, drawing the room's moisture into its slow negotiations, and you adjust your expectations knowing that drying and finish will follow the weather's pace. A fine beetled surface asks for drying under pressure, and that is why the timing matters so much, because the cloth's condition during pounding helps determine the final character. Too wet, and the blows may not polish as intended. Too dry, and the fibers resist rather than settle. Between those states lies the working balance, not fixed by a clock alone but by experience, and a beetler finds it through touch, sight, and the old measuring instrument of patience. If you were to lift a single linen thread and look closely, you would see that it is not perfectly round like a drawn wire, but made of fibers with their own tiny shapes and surfaces. Beetling presses those surfaces into closer arrangement within the weave, flattening and smoothing the face of the fabric so light travels more evenly along it. The explanation may be simple when spoken plainly, yet the doing of it requires hours, and those hours become part of the linen's final character. There are trades where the result is immediate, where a cupboard falls away or a brick is set in mortar, and the change can be seen almost as soon as the hand moves. Beetling is slower and less showy because much of the transformation accumulates beneath repetition, showing itself gradually in handle and sheen rather than in a dramatic change of form. This makes the work suitable for a mind willing to notice small degrees, and over time you come to trust those degrees as much as any large sign. In the room, the machines stand like patient furniture made powerful, not graceful exactly, but carrying a beauty that comes from purpose and wear. Their timbers are rubbed dark where hands have passed, their metalwork holds old oil in seams and corners, and their motion, when running well, has the calm authority of something properly fitted to its task. You may never call them beautiful aloud, because working people often save such words for other occasions, yet your care for them says something close to affection. A loose bolt, a worn bearing, or a damaged hammer face is not merely a mechanical inconvenience, because it can mark the cloth and wastework already done by many hands. So maintenance is part of finishing, and the beetler's attention extends from fabric to machine, from machine to water, and from water back to the schedule of the day. Nothing in the process stands alone, and a length of linen carries the condition of an entire small world within its surface. When a hammer face is examined, you look for roughness, splintering, or uneven wear that might strike the roll badly. The wood must be sound and smooth enough for the work, because every flaw repeats itself as often as the hammer falls, and repetition magnifies both care and carelessness. A tiny rough place that seems harmless at first can become 1,000 tiny rough touches before the hour is out, and that is why the room teaches respect for smallness. The same is true of wrinkles, stains, slack winding, grit on the floor, or a hand that has not been washed before touching pale cloth. Linen is honest in the way it reveals handling, and a mark once set into a fine piece can travel forward into inspection, sale, and use. You learn not to resent that honesty because it keeps the work clean and attentive, and it reminds you that even the quietest materials have standards they will not hide. At the end of a long run, when a roll is removed or sent onward, there is a moment of open space where it had been, and the machine seems briefly incomplete. Another beam will take its place, another length will be wound, and the old sequence will gather itself again. But for a few breaths, the absence is noticeable. You may brush lint from your sleeve, flex your fingers, and watch the finished cloth carried away, feeling not triumph, exactly, but the mild release of work brought to a proper pause. The finished linen does not look eager to leave. It lies folded or rolled with the composure of something that has been handled thoroughly, and now asks only to be kept clean. Its sheen is not boastful, especially under the grey light of a Cork afternoon, but it appears, when the angle changes, a soft running brightness along the threads. That small play of light is what hours of knocking have made possible, and if you notice it, with quiet satisfaction, no one need say more. In another part of the mill, inspection may find faults that were born earlier in spinning or weaving, and sometimes the beetler's room will be blamed for what it could not have caused. Such misunderstandings belong to many trades, because a finished object passes through so many hands that the last hands are easy to notice. Still, good workers learn the difference between defensiveness and attention, and if there is a lesson to be taken from a flawed piece, you take it, because the next roll is already waiting. There are days when the body aches more than usual, when damp weather settles into the joints and the floor feels harder beneath the boots. The lifting, guiding, bending, and standing accumulate quietly, and though the machine does the hammering, the worker carries the strain of watching and handling. Yet the routine has a way of drawing you through discomfort one step at a time, not by denying it, but by giving the body familiar actions to follow until the evening comes round. A person listening from far away might imagine this labor as monotonous, and in one sense it is, because the same sounds and motions return hour after hour. But monotony can hold many shades when you live inside it, just as a river that seems uniformly grey from a bridge has currents, eddies, reflections, and small changes of depth below. The beetling room is like that, a repeated pattern full of quiet variations, and the worker's life inside it is not empty, but attuned. The air grows powdery where dry fibers loosen, and now and then you wipe your face with the back of your wrist, leaving a pale streak near the cuff. Lint clings to dark cloth, to hair, to the damp edge of a sleeve, and by the end of the day everyone carries a little evidence of the material they have served. In mills of many kinds, workers take home flour dust, coal dust, sawdust, wool fibre, or metal filings, and here the trace is linen, soft and light, a ghost of thread. In a good week, orders move steadily, the water holds, and the machines behave themselves with only ordinary complaints. In a poorer week, a delay in one room waits upon another, weather interferes, a belt breaks, or a customer's requirement changes just enough to unsettle the rhythm. The beetler cannot command all of this, and so he learns the measured patience of someone whose skill matters deeply but still belongs within a larger chain of circumstance. That chain reaches backward to the field and forward to the customer, but in the middle it is held by workers who may never meet one another. The spinner does not stand beside the beetler, the bleacher may not know the finisher's face, and the person who cuts the cloth may never hear the hammering that gave it its hand. Still, their labours touch invisibly through the fabric, and a good length of linen is a meeting place for many kinds of attention. As evening approaches again, the room begins its slow return to stillness, though not all at once, because mills rarely sleep as simply as houses. One machine may stop while another continues, one worker may sweep while another checks a roll, and the final sounds loosen themselves gradually from the day's pattern. You move through the familiar closing tasks, placing wedges, covering what should be covered, and making sure the damp cloth will wait safely until morning's return. The hammers, once raised and falling, are now only shapes in the dimming room, their faces near the beams, and their stocks angled in rest. Without motion, they seem heavier than before, as though movement had been lightening them all day by giving their weight a purpose. You look once toward the window, where the last light has gone grey and flat, and the glass reflects the inside of the beetling room back to itself in a faint blurred image. There is a hush after labour that is not the same as silence before labour, because the room has spent itself and settled, and everything in it seems aware of use. The floor holds the day's footprints beneath the sweeping, the tools are returned with a little more polish on their handles, and the linen waits in its wound layers, changed by all the strikes it has received. You can feel the difference between a place unvisited and a place resting after work, and this room is deeply the second kind. When you step outside, the air may feel cooler than expected, and the first breath away from starch and oil opens the chest gently. The city has its evening sounds now, lower than morning, with wheels moving slower, doors closing, and voices carrying from places where lamps are being lit. Behind you, the beetling room holds its darkness, and though the hammers are still, the memory of their rhythm travels with you for a while, softer with every step, until it becomes part of the ordinary night. By the time you reach your street, the sound has thinned into something almost private, less a knocking than a pulse remembered in the bones. A person who has never worked among machines may think the body leaves the mill when the boots cross the threshold, but some part of the day always comes home in the hands, in the hearing, and in the way tired shoulders settle near the fire. You wash as well as you can, and the water in the basin clouds faintly with dust, starch, and the pale little traces of linen that cling to skin as stubbornly as memory. There may be children in the house who know the smell of the beetling room without ever naming it, just as they know the smell of rain on coats or bread cooling beneath a cloth. They might ask very little about the day, because work is a background fact in their lives, steady and necessary, not a story told for entertainment. Yet if one of them touches your sleeve and finds a small white fibre caught there, you may lift it away and roll it between finger and thumb, feeling again the fine dry strength of the material that has filled your hours. Sleep, when it comes, is not always quick, because the room inside your head may continue its ordered falling, hammer after hammer, beat after beat. The sound softens as you lie still, becoming less like machinery and more like distant surf, while the fire lowers and the house makes its own smaller noises around you. Somewhere beyond the roofs, the same water that turned the wheel moves onward through the city, under bridges and past quay walls, carrying the dark reflection of lamps and stars with an old, untroubled patience. Morning returns with little ceremony, and before the work begins again, there is the brief clean hour when the mill has not yet gathered its full voice. The frames stand in the half-light, and the belts hang with the slackness that makes them seem almost harmless, as though yesterday's power were only a rumour attached to leather and wood. You cross the floor carefully because habit does not wait for daylight, and you lay your hand on the beam in greeting, feeling the cool, rounded surface beneath the linen. There are small repairs to make before the hammers rise, and these are among the quieter duties of a beetler, though they shape the day as surely as any hour of running. A wedge must be seated more firmly, an oil hole cleared, a strap examined where its edge has begun to fray, and a hammer face checked for the faint roughness that could trouble the cloth. You work slowly, not because you lack urgency, but because haste near machinery often creates the very delay it wishes to avoid. The tool you choose has a worn handle, darkened by sweat and oil, until the wood feels almost polished, and it fits the palm with the familiarity of an old spoon. You tighten a nut, wipe away grit, and listen when the part settles into place, because even a small adjustment has its own sound if you are close enough to hear it. Around you, other rooms begin to stir, and the mill becomes a gathering of separate awakenings, each trade and task finding its rhythm before the full day begins. In a linen works, maintenance is not separate from production, however much ledgers may put it in another column. The smoothness of a finished cloth depends on the condition of the beam, the steadiness of the drive, the cleanliness of the room, and the judgment that stops a machine before a small fault becomes a large one. A careful beetler knows that a quiet repair before breakfast can save a spoiled length by afternoon, and that prevention, though rarely praised, is one of the most useful forms of skill. The first run begins with a tremor through the frame. Then the lifting sequence takes hold, and the beetles resume their plain wooden speech. The hammers drop into their pattern, not exactly together, not entirely apart, and the effect is a layered knocking that fills the chest as much as the ear. You stand with one foot slightly forward on the boards, weight balanced from long practice, and the morning closes itself around you with the steady pressure of work resumed. The cloth on this beam is a heavier piece, meant perhaps for sheeting or table use, and it answers the hammers with a deeper sound than the finer lengths. Its dampness has not fully left it, and the starch gives a faint body to the fabric that your fingers can sense when you lift a loose edge for inspection. It will need time, and time is what the beetling room gives, not generously perhaps, but reliably in measured falls of wood and slow turns of the roll. You notice how the selvage sits. That finished edge made by the weaving stronger and firmer than the cut places will be later. If it wanders, the winding will tell on itself, and so your eyes return to it again and again, following its line as it travels around the beam. There is something restful in watching an edge kept true, because much of life refuses such neatness, while here at least a straight line can be tended with care. Now and then a foreman comes through with order notes or a question from another department, and his presence changes the air only slightly. He looks at the roll, listens for a moment, asks after the finish, and then leaves you to your listening because a room like this cannot be governed entirely from a desk. The records may say what length, what width, what customer, and what treatment, but the cloth under the beetles still needs the worker beside it, the one who can read what the paper cannot feel. The order books may carry names of merchants, houses, or warehouses, but for you, the pieces are known more by texture and behavior. This one dries slowly, that one lies obediently, another has a stubborn corner, another takes a sheen with surprising ease, as though it had been waiting for the hammers all along. You remember them not as people remember faces, exactly, but as hands remember tasks, in small bodily impressions that return when the same kind of cloth arrives again. In older beetling rooms, before power and layout were improved, the work could be cramped and heavy, with much lifting and shifting done in conditions that left little room for comfort. By the 1910s, some mills had better arrangements and stronger machinery, though comfort was still a modest word in places built first for production. The worker's ease came less from softness than from familiarity, from knowing where to stand, when to step back, and how to let the machine's force pass by without drawing him into its path. Safety in such a room is practical and unsentimental, learned through warnings, near misses, and the ordinary caution of people who understand moving parts. You keep loose cloth controlled, hands clear of places where power is traveling, and attention divided in the right way, never so fixed on one detail that the rest of the machine disappears. This watchfulness is not dramatic. It is simply part of being at work, woven into the day like another thread in the linen. The beetles rise and fall, and the room grows warmer as the morning deepens, though the corners near the walls stay cool. Light enters more strongly now, showing the color of the cloth with greater honesty, and the pale surface begins to reveal the subtle changes made by the repeated pounding. You see not a sudden shine, but a gathering smoothness, a calm tightening of the weave, and the day's first real satisfaction comes in that almost hidden change. There is a way of touching finished linen that differs from touching unfinished cloth, and the distinction becomes second nature over years. You do not grab or pinch, but pass the hand along the surface, feeling for drag, roughness, slackness, or that desirable compact glide which says the work is drawing near its aim. The hand moves gently because the judgment is fine, and though the hammers do the forceful part, the final decision arrives through touch. Some finishes ask for repeated wetting and beetling, or for intervals of rest, because the process depends on the gradual partnership between moisture and pressure. The cloth may be taken away, treated again, returned, rewound, and set under the hammers once more, each passage adding to the body and sheen without making the fabric false. To an impatient eye, this would seem excessive, but linen rewards slow treatment, and in the beetling room, excess is avoided not by haste, but by balance. You know that balance in the way a baker knows dough, or a cooper knows the swelling of staves, through experience gathered in the same motions year after year. It is not enough to say that the cloth must be damp, because damp has many degrees, and each degree changes how the hammering enters the weave. Nor is it enough to say that the cloth must shine, because a proper shine has depth and restraint, while an overworked surface can lose the quiet firmness that gives linen its grace. At times, when the machine runs steadily and no adjustment is needed, your mind may travel backward through the making of the cloth, not in scholarly detail, but through scraps of knowledge passed around the trade. You picture flax pulled from the ground with roots attached because cutting would shorten the fiber, and then laid to ret or steep until the woody stem loosened its hold. You picture scutching knives, hackles like sharp combs, spinners drawing thread, and looms making the crossing of warp and weft. That will eventually come under your hammers. Each earlier stage has its own sound, and although you work in beetling, you carry some imagined echo of all of them. The crackle of breaking flax, the rasp of hackling, the hum of spinning, the shuttle's travel, the splash of washing, and the rustle of drying cloth all belong to the same long family of labor. The beetling room adds its knocking to that family, deep and repetitive, like a closing phrase that does not end the song but gives it weight. The people who buy the linen may care most about its appearance, its smoothness, its whiteness, and its durability, and these are fair things to care about. Yet behind each quality lies a set of working conditions, weather decisions, material judgments, and bodily efforts that rarely travel with the finished goods. A cloth folded in a shop is quiet about its history, and perhaps that is why someone like you must learn to find meaning not in recognition, but in the making itself. The day continues, and the roll turns a little farther, bringing a fresh portion beneath the beetles, while the finished portion rests within the wound layers. You shift your stance, wipe your hands, and check that the cloth is feeding properly, though feeding is too active a word for such slow movement. The linen is being presented almost ceremonially to the falling wood, and the machine receives it with the same steady rhythm it offered to yesterday's length and will offer to tomorrow's. At noon, the stopping of the hammers again creates that strange spaciousness, when the walls seem to move outward and the ear must adjust to ordinary sounds. Someone laughs in another room, and the laugh sounds unexpectedly clear, almost delicate after the pounding, before it is swallowed by footsteps and low talk. You eat close to the door where the air is cooler, and a few crumbs fall onto your coat where they mingle with the lint as if everything in the day wishes to become dust. Food tastes different in a mill, perhaps because the body has already spent so much of itself by the time it sits down. Tea is not merely tea, but heat held between the hands, and bread is not merely bread, but a firm, simple answer to hunger. You look at the cloth while you eat, not anxiously, but because the eyes are used to returning there, and even at rest the work remains gently present in the room. During a longer pause, you might step outside and stand where the water race passes, hearing the stream without the masking force of the machines. The water is brownish or grey depending on weather, moving with bits of leaf, straw, and city reflection, and it has no opinion about linen, though it has helped make so much of it. It turns wheels, carries waste, cools stone, brightens morning air, and continues beyond the mill with a smooth indifference that feels almost kind. The reliance on water gives the work a rhythm older than steam and electricity, even when other powers have begun to enter the industrial world. A water-driven mill belongs to its site in a particular way, answering to gradient, channel, gate, wheel, and season, rather than existing anywhere equally. In Cork, where waterways and trade routes shape daily movement, that connection between place and work feels natural, as though the mill has grown from the local dampened stone. Back inside, the air is heavier after the outside coolness, and the machines seem to resume not from silence but from expectation. The belt takes up, the shaft turns, the beetles rise, and the sound returns with a familiarity so complete that the pause begins to seem like the unusual part. You settle again beside the frame, and the afternoon opens in the only way it knows, through repeated motion, repeated judgment, and the mild concentration of continuing. A new worker may find the afternoon harder than the morning, because the body's first strength has been spent and the end of the day is still not near enough to lean upon. An older worker knows to narrow his attention, not to the whole afternoon which is too large, but to the next check, the next adjustment, the next smooth yard of cloth. In this way, long labor becomes bearable, divided into honest portions, and the mind rests in each small duty before moving to the next. You notice a faint unevenness and stop the machine, not abruptly, but with the practice sequence that lets motion leave the frame safely. The silence gathers, and you lean over the roll to examine the place where the edge has begun to lift slightly, perhaps from a hidden slackness in the winding or a change in the cloth's dampness. With another pair of hands, you correct it carefully, smoothing and tightening, because the best time to mend a small mistake is while it is still small. The correction takes patience, and no one watching from outside the trade would see anything remarkable in it. Yet this is the daily craft, not the loud fall of the beetles alone, but the quiet intervention that prevents a scar in the finish. You return the roll to its proper set, start the machine again, and listen until the sound reassures you that the cloth is lying correctly beneath the wooden faces. In the flow of the afternoon, the distinction between machine and worker becomes less like separation and more like cooperation, though the machine has no mind and the cloth has no intention. The beetles provide the force, the water provides the turning, the frame provides the order, and you provide attention, which is the part no mechanism can entirely replace. Without attention, repetition becomes damage. With attention, repetition becomes finish, and this difference is the quiet heart of the trade. The floor beneath you carries faint vibrations, not enough to trouble balance, but enough to remind the soles of your boots that power is moving through the building. Over time, those vibrations become part of posture, and you learn where boards are firm, where they spring a little, and where a knot in the timber makes one patch feel different from another. Such knowledge is too small for maps and too ordinary for records, yet it belongs completely to working life, and losing it would be losing part of the place. A visiting inspector, merchant, or owner might walk through and notice output, cleanliness, and the condition of the machinery, all sensible things from his point of view. He may not notice the tiny leaning habits of the workers, the wordless exchanges, or the way a beetler places his body at a safe angle without thinking. Every workplace has a visible order and an invisible one, and the invisible order is made of practice, caution, friendship, irritation, memory, and trust. Toward the later afternoon, when the light begins its slow decline, the sheen on the cloth becomes easier to see at certain angles. You lift a section, if the process allows it, and the fabric catches the graying window light in a muted line, not bright like silk, but calm like polished bone or still water. It is a modest beauty, and perhaps that modesty suits linen, which has always belonged to washing, folding, wearing, covering, and the plain rituals of home. The hammers continue, and in their falling there is an odd tenderness if one listens long enough, because each blow helps the cloth become useful in a finer way. Force is being spent not to break, but to smooth, not to punish the fabric, but to settle its fibers into a closer harmony. This is why the work can be described gently, despite its weight, because the intention of the whole room is toward finish, service, and order. When the day nears its end, you begin to think ahead to the morning without wanting the present task to hurry. A roll left correctly will greet you kindly, while a roll left poorly will carry your carelessness into the next day before you have even taken off your coat. So you check, tidy, and prepare as though doing a favor for your future self. And this small courtesy across time is one of the hidden comforts of routine. The last minutes are not empty, because endings in a mill need attention of their own, and machines deserve to be left in a state that will not betray anyone later. You clear the loose threads, set aside the tools, make sure the cloth is protected from dirt and accidental damp, and give a final look to the hammer faces and the line of the beam. The room dims around these actions, and each one seems slower because the body knows the shift is nearly done. At last the beetles come to rest again, and their silence falls more deeply than any single hammer blow. The water outside continues with its low passage, but the room's great wooden pulse has ceased, leaving behind the tick of cooling parts and the soft scuff of boots on boards. You stand a moment longer than necessary, not from sentiment alone, but because a careful worker often looks twice, and the second look is where forgotten things are found. Nothing has been forgotten. The linen rests on the beam, firm and quiet, holding the day's repeated touches in its tightened weave. You take your coat, feel the dampness in the evening air as you open the door, and leave the beetling room to its own darkness, where the tools wait in their places and the cloth continues its slow inward settling. The darkness of the room is not emptiness, because the roll remains there with its wound layers cooling together, and the hammers hang above it like thoughts paused halfway through a sentence. During the night, the dampness in the cloth continues to settle, and the starch, already pressed and worked, lies more evenly among the fibers. By morning, when you return and push open the door, the linen will have changed in a way too small for strangers to notice, but clear enough to the practiced hand. There are mornings when a fresh length waits nearby, rolled from another department and marked for treatment, and its arrival changes the order of the day before the machines begin. You examine the ticket or mark attached to it, but the paper is only a beginning, because the cloth itself must confirm what has been written. Width, weight, dampness, finish required, and any warning from the previous room all become part of your first quiet judgment, made in the dim light while the mill is still gathering its voice. A good beetler does not treat all linen as the same simply because it shares a name, and this is one of the reasons the job is more thoughtful than it appears. A fine cambric-like piece will not answer like a heavier sheeting, and a cloth woven closely before it arrives will behave differently from one that still has openness in the thread. You learn to match force, time, moisture, and handling to the nature of the piece, just as a person learns to speak softly in one room and more firmly in another. The roll is lifted or set with care, and the work of placing it in the frame is never casual, because the beginning decides so much of what follows. The beam must sit true, the cloth must run evenly, and the first turns must be watched with a patience that feels almost ceremonial, though no one uses such a word. When the machine begins and the hammers take up their fall, you listen to the new length's answer, because each cloth has a slightly different sound beneath the beetles. Some pieces give back a full and padded note, while others sound sharper until the layers begin to settle and the dampness distributes under pressure. Your ear becomes a kind of measuring tool, not replacing the hand or the eye, but joining them in a small council of senses. If a sound is wrong, you look for the reason, and if it is right, you let the room continue, because needless interference can be its own form of trouble. The old hands in the mill may speak of cloth, almost as if it had temperament, calling one length kindly and another awkward, though they know perfectly well that fibers have no moods. Such speech is not superstition so much as a practical shorthand for behavior learned through years of handling, and it lets workers describe complexity without making a lecture of it. A kindly piece winds evenly, takes starch well, dries at a decent pace, and accepts the beetles with a smoothness that makes the day feel lighter. An awkward piece asks for more watching, more stopping, more smoothing, and perhaps a little more patience than the schedule had allowed. It may hold damp in one part, resist finish in another, or show a stubborn crease that has traveled from some earlier handling and now refuses to disappear easily. You do what can be done without annoyance, because annoyance adds nothing useful to the cloth, while steadiness, even when tired, may still save the finish. There is a particular quiet in correcting a crease before it becomes fixed, because the whole room seems to wait while your fingers persuade the cloth back into order. You do not tug sharply, since sharpness can stretch one part and disturb another, but guide the linen gently along its own grain, until the raised place lies flat again. Then the beam turns, the hammers resume, and the problem is taken back into the rhythm, where repeated pressure may soften the memory of that small fault. The work gives you many such small rescues, and perhaps that is why a finished piece can feel peaceful, because it has passed through so many moments where trouble did not quite happen. A stain avoided, a fold corrected, a belt adjusted, a damp edge protected, a rough hammer face smoothed before it could mark the cloth. All these disappear into the final surface. The customer sees only linen calm and ready, while the beetler remembers, if he remembers anything, the little turnings by which it was kept whole. Near the door, a broom leans against the wall, and it is used more often than a visitor might expect in a room ruled by heavy machines. Loose lint, grit, wood dust, and stray threads all have ways of becoming larger nuisances. And pale cloth is especially unforgiving when dirt is allowed to travel. Sweeping is not an interruption of the trade, but one of its quieter supports. And the broom, humble as it is, belongs beside the hammers in the order of care. The boards must be kept clean but not slippery, and the paths around the frames must be free for hands carrying cloth or tools. A small chip underfoot could alter a step at the wrong moment, and a scrap drawn into motion could become a delay, so ordinary tidiness becomes part of safety. In this way, the beetling room teaches that order is not a severe thing, but a kindness extended to everyone who will move through the day. At times, the finishing room sends someone to ask how a length is coming on, and the answer is rarely long. It may be a nod, a phrase, or a hand laid flat and moved across the air to indicate smoothness, because the noise prefers short speech even when the sentences in the mind are longer. The message passes back through the mill, and the cloth continues, belonging not to one person alone, but to a chain of workers who each add their small portion. Women may be working elsewhere in the linen process, in inspection, folding, mending, or other finishing tasks, their hands moving quickly over surfaces that your machines have helped prepare. They find slubs, marks, weak places, or uneven finish, and their judgment can be as sharp as any foreman's, because cloth reveals itself to those who handle it closely. Though the beetling room may feel like its own world, it is never truly separate from the other rooms, where eyes and fingers continue the same quiet conversation with linen. When a piece leaves your frame, it may go onward to calendaring, pressing, measuring, folding, or packing, depending on the kind of finish required and the practices of the works. Some cloths are passed between rollers for smoothness, some are folded with exactness, and some are inspected under light that shows every raised thread and flaw. Beetling is one part of a larger finishing language, and its sentence is weight, moisture, and repeated wooden touch. The warehouse has a different calm, with bales and rolls arranged in patient rows, labels tied securely, and the smell of finished cloth drier and cleaner than the beetling room. There, the linen seems to have become more formal, less like damp work, and more like trade, ready for ledgers, carts, rail, ship, shop, and household. A beetler entering such a space might feel the distance between process and product, because the cloth no longer appears to need him, though it carries his work in its surface. In Cork, goods have always known roads and water, and finished linen might move through streets where other trades press close on every side. A cart can pass a brewery, a butter market, a quay, a print shop, a churchyard wall, and a row of small houses before the cloth has even left the city's ordinary air. The world of the beetling room is enclosed, but its work is not, and every roll leaving the mill begins another quiet journey beyond the door. You may see a bale loaded one afternoon and think no more of it, because the next beam already waits and the day still has tasks enough. Yet there is a softness in knowing that what has been made here will travel, not with your name, but with the touch of your routine hidden inside it. Many working lives are like that, carried forward anonymously in objects used by people who never pause to imagine the hands behind their comfort. The anonymity is not always a sadness, because there is also relief in doing a task well without being watched by the whole world. The cloth asks for attention, not performance, and the machine asks for respect, not applause, and the day asks to be completed with enough care that tomorrow can begin cleanly. In such a life, meaning is gathered quietly, like lint in a corner, small piece by small piece, until its presence cannot be denied. The hammers continue, and the day narrows again to their fall, while outside the city moves through business, weather, errands, and talk. You may hear a distant bell through the walls when the machine pauses, or the call of a vendor, or the wheel of a cart hitting a stone in the yard. These outer sounds remind you that the beetling room is both separate from life and deeply part of it, a working chamber within a living place. In the 1910s, news can enter even the most repetitive rooms, brought by papers, rumors, letters, and men who have heard something near the docks or station. Still, news has to wait its turn beside the labor, because cloth does not finish itself while people discuss the world. A few words are exchanged during dinner, perhaps about politics, prices, emigration, or war talk in Europe, and then the conversation fades beneath the returning beat. The linen itself is older than any of these concerns, not untouched by them, but belonging to a deeper history of households, work, and trade. For centuries, flax and linen have linked fields to spinning wheels, cottages to markets, mills to merchants, and ordinary hands to objects kept for years in presses and drawers. Standing beside the beetling engine, you are one worker in that long continuation, though your immediate thought may be only whether the roll is drying too fast. That is how history often feels from inside a job, not grand or distant, but present, as a set of tools already worn when you receive them. The frame was built before you came, the method learned before your apprenticeship, the phrases of the trade spoken before you understood them, and the cloth itself carries agricultural seasons you never saw. You inherit all this in plain form through the day's tasks, and you pass it onward by keeping the work steady. An apprentice, if one is near you, may be asked first to sweep, fetch, watch, and carry, because skill begins by learning the room before claiming the machine. He learns when not to stand in the way, which tools belong where, how to keep cloth off a dirty surface, and why a beam must be approached with attention rather than confidence. Only gradually does he move closer to judgment, and the slow admission into responsibility gives the work its weight. You might show him the edge of a cloth that looks sound but hides a slight uneven winding beneath its surface. He sees little at first, so you ask him to place his hand there, and then perhaps he notices the raised place under his palm. Nothing more needs to be said for a moment, because the body has learned what words alone could not give it, and that is how many trades keep their truth. Later, he may hear a belt complaining before he knows why, and you may let him puzzle it out while standing close enough to prevent harm. The answer comes through patience, not embarrassment, and when he understands, the room has become slightly more legible to him. In this way, learning is not separate from production, but folded into it as the next generation becomes useful, one careful noticing at a time. The older workers carry many such lessons, though not all are gentle in manner, and a tired man may correct sharply when cloth or safety is at stake. Still, beneath the roughness, there is often a shared understanding that the room must be respected, because machinery has no patience for foolishness. A good apprentice learns the tone of warning, the tone of irritation, and the tone of real concern, and he learns to answer each with attention. Your own first days may return to you in flashes, especially when the younger worker makes a mistake you once made. You remember the overwhelming sound, the difficulty of hearing speech, the strangeness of judging damp cloth, and the ache of muscles unused to standing on vibrating boards. Those memories soften your judgment, though not your standards, because linen and machinery both require careful work, whatever a person's age or experience. There is a humility in realizing that expertise often feels ordinary after long practice, and what once seemed impossible becomes simply the way a day is done. You do not think, each time, of the many separate judgments made by hand, ear, and eye, because they have become joined into one habit of working. Yet if you were absent, and another less practiced person stood there, the difference would show, not immediately perhaps, but somewhere in the cloth's finish. The afternoon brings a slight clearing in the weather, and the window brightens enough to show the fine airborne fibers turning slowly in the light. They drift without hurry, each one almost nothing, and together they make the air visible, softening the hard lines of frame, beam, and hammer. You watch them only for a breath before returning to the roll, but the sight stays with you, a pale moving dust that seems to belong to the silence inside noise. There are many kinds of dust in industrial rooms, and each carries the character of what people make there. Coal dust darkens, flour dust sweetens the air, sawdust warms the smell of timber, and linen lint has a faint, dry cleanness that clings lightly before vanishing. It settles on shoulders, ledges, and hair, and when the day ends, the broom gathers what the work has shed. Not waste exactly, but the small, loose evidence of making. If the hammers are stopped for a longer adjustment, the room may reveal sounds usually hidden beneath the work. Water murmurs outside, a cart creaks in the yard, someone coughs beyond a wall, and a bird on the roof gives a few quick notes before flying off. These small sounds do not replace the beetling rhythm. They wait behind it all day, like details in a cloth that show only when the light falls at the right angle. You tighten the adjustment, test the motion by hand where it is safe, and signal for the drive to be taken up again. The room fills once more, and the smaller sounds recede, not gone, but folded under the stronger pattern of wooden heads and turning shafts. There is a reassurance in that return, because a steady machine means the work is moving forward, and forward, in such a room, often means simply continuing. Some days bring a cloth that has already acquired a faint smell from an earlier damp delay, not spoiled, but needing attention before it grows unpleasant. Linen, like any natural fibre, can hold the evidence of neglect, and a beetler learns that freshness is part of quality, not merely a matter for laundry later on. The cloth must be aired, dried, treated, and protected from sourness, because a fine finish cannot fully hide poor keeping. This care against souring belongs especially to damp climates and damp processes where cloth spends so much of its making in water, mist, and warm enclosed rooms. To people outside the trade, whiteness and smoothness may seem like the main achievements, but simple clean keeping is just as necessary and sometimes more difficult than it appears. The worker's nose becomes another quiet instrument, catching mildew, stale starch, oil, or smoke before such things settle too deeply into the piece. Oil is useful everywhere in the machinery and unwelcome almost anywhere on pale linen. You handle oil cans carefully, wipe excess from places where it could travel, and keep cloth away from bearing drips, because a dark spot can undo hours of careful finishing. The contrast between necessary lubrication and necessary cleanliness gives the room one of its constant tensions, managed by habit, rag, placement, and watchfulness. A rag used for oil must not become a rag used near cloth, and such distinctions, though small, are part of the discipline of the place. Tools and cloths acquire categories that no written sign may mark, yet everyone who works there understands them, because the cost of mixing them is visible and lasting. In old workshops, order often lives this way, not in labels, but in a shared map of what belongs near what, and what must be kept apart. The smell of oil has its own comfort when it stays where it should, mingling with timber, leather, and iron to make the deep background scent of machinery. It tells you that parts have been cared for, that friction has been answered, and that the frame is ready to bear another day of falling weight. Like all useful smells, it can become unpleasant if excessive, but in the right measure, it is simply part of the beetling room's weather. Toward the end of the week, fatigue sits differently in the body, less sharp than a single hard day, and more like a coat worn too long. The same boards, beams, tools, and sounds meet you each morning, and the sameness can either weigh upon the mind or carry it, depending on the hour. Often it does both, because real work seldom offers one feeling at a time, and the beetler's calm is not emptiness, but a practiced endurance. Payday, when it comes, belongs to the practical world beyond the machines, to coins, accounts, rent, food, boots, coal, and perhaps a small purchase that makes the household easier. The wage carries the week's hours out of the mill and into the streets, where labor becomes bread, light, heat, and school things for children. Yet, even then, the connection is quiet and indirect, because the beetles do not sound in the shop, and the shopkeeper may never know the cloth that helped earn the coins. In working families, each wage has places already waiting for it, and a man may feel both relief and limitation as money is divided. There is dignity in providing, but also pressure, because illness, slack orders, Broken tools or wider troubles can disturb a household quickly. The routine of the beetling room may feel narrow, but it is attached to the broader routine of survival, where ordinary steadiness matters more than any dramatic fortune. The mill itself depends on orders, materials, transport, and markets, and the workers feel those forces mostly through the availability of work and the pace demanded by the day. A full order book can mean long hours and tired bodies, while a slack period brings its own unease, because rest without wages is not rest in the same way. So the sound of machines running may be tiring, but it can also be reassuring, since noise in a mill often means employment. There is no need to romanticize hardship to find beauty in the work, because the beauty lies not in poverty or strain, but in the competence people bring despite them. The beetler's hand on the cloth, the careful ear turned toward the hammer, the broom used before dirt can spread, and the patient correction of an edge are all real human graces. They do not cancel difficulty, but they stand beside it, showing how people make order within the conditions given to them. As the weeks pass, some lengths become familiar not individually, but as seasons of work, heavier goods perhaps in one period, and finer pieces in another. The mill's rhythm changes with orders, weather, and trade, though to an outsider, it may always sound like the same wooden knocking from behind the wall. You know the differences, and because you know them, the year becomes textured, marked not only by holidays or weather, but by the kinds of linen passing under your care. Spring damp as one feel, summer warmth another, autumn rain another, and winter cold another again. In cold weather, hands are slower at first, cloth feels stiffer, and the room takes longer to gather its workable warmth, while in summer, the damp heat can make the air close and heavy. The trade is indoors, but it is never free from season, because linen, water, wood, and human bodies all answer to the changing air. On a winter morning, the first touch of the beam can almost sting, and the hammers seem reluctant until motion has warmed the frame. Your breath may cloud near the door, while deeper in the room, the damp cloth releases a faint vapor as work begins. The contrast of cold hands and warming machinery gives the morning a particular slowness, and every task feels as though it must be coaxed awake with patience. In summer, the room may begin warm and only grow warmer, with open windows admitting both air and the noises of the yard. The smell of starch thickens, shirts cling, and the cloth dries differently, sometimes too quickly at the edges, if not watched. You drink more tea or water when you can, wipe your forehead, and continue, because the hammers do not change their nature for heat, and the linen still asks for evenness. Rainy days belong naturally to Cork, and the beetling room on such days feels almost like the inside of a cloud made of timber and cloth. The walls darken, the windows blur, and the steady knocking seems softer, as if the weather outside has padded the world around the mill. Damp weather can be troublesome, yet it also suits the mood of the work, drawing everything into a slower register where wood, linen, and water feel closely related. When the rain eases, the gutters still drip, and the yard holds the smell of whetstone, horse, coal smoke, and river air. If you step out during a pause, your face cools at once, and for a moment the body stands between two kinds of dampness, the open weather outside and the warm cloth damp inside. Then you return to the machine, bringing a little of the outside air with you on your coat, and the room accepts it without comment. The hammers fall through all these weathers, and their steadiness becomes a measure against which the changing world is felt. A person might grow tired of the sound, and sometimes does, but the rhythm can also anchor the day when everything beyond the walls seems unsettled. In that repeated wooden descent, there is no argument, no speculation, only the next necessary stroke, and then the next, and then the next, until the cloth has received its time. By now your hands know how to rest lightly even while working, wasting no extra motion, because labor done for years teaches economy. You do not lift higher than needed, do not grip harder than required, and do not cross the floor without doing some small useful thing on the way. Such economy is not laziness but preservation, the wisdom of a body that must return tomorrow and the day after, carrying the same tasks. There are many motions in a beetler's day that no one would think to record, though together they make the work possible. The wiping of a palm before touching cloth, the tilt of the head toward a changed sound, the brief bend to clear lint, the steadying of a roll with one hand while another worker adjusts the far edge, all of these form the hidden choreography of routine. They are not showy, but they are precise. A person who has spent years in such a room may carry its movements even into idleness, rubbing fingers together as if testing fiber, or turning slightly when a distant sound resembles a belt. Work shapes the body gently and persistently, not only in callus and ache, but in attention, posture, and the small reflexes of care. The beetler becomes, in some measure, a keeper of surfaces, a listener to repetition, and a companion to linen. The cloth continues to pass under the hammers, though pass is still too swift a word for what happens. It dwells under them, receives them, turns by degrees, rests in its wound layers, and gradually becomes more finished than it was when the day began. There is no single moment when unfinished becomes finished, only a threshold approached through many signs, until hand, eye, ear, and schedule agree that the length has had enough. Knowing when something has had enough is a subtle skill in any craft, and perhaps in any life. Too little care leaves the work incomplete, too much fuss can spoil what was already good, and between neglect and overwork lies the calm judgment that comes slowly through experience. The beetling room teaches this every day, with cloth that asks to be pressed but not abused, dried but not hardened, polished but not made false. When the length is ready to move onward, you do not celebrate. You prepare the transfer. The beam is handled, the cloth protected, the next instruction noted, and the space around the frame made ready for whatever follows. The satisfaction is folded into action, because in working rooms, completion rarely stands still long enough to be admired, and the next piece arrives with its own quiet claim. Still, there may be one brief moment when the finished surface catches the light, and you allow yourself to look. The linen shows a soft sheen, close and clean, with the weave lying flatter than before, and the hand of the cloth changed by the hours behind it. You see the result of repetition made visible, and the sight gives the heart a small, steady pleasure, as plain and sufficient as warm tea after rain. Then the day resumes, because mills are made of continuations, and one good finish does not complete the week. Another roll waits, another adjustment is needed, another sweep of the floor must be made before dust travels where it should not. The work does not ask you to be inspired, it asks you to be present, and in that presence there is a quietness strong enough to carry the afternoon. As the light lowers again, the beetling room begins to gather its evening character, the same and not the same as yesterday. Shadows lengthen under the frames, the window glass grows dull, and the hammers, still moving, seem more deeply colored against the dimness. You stand within the fading day, listening to the measured fall of wood on linen, and you feel how repetition can become almost tender when it has been kept with care. The final stopping will come, though not yet, and the thought of it rests somewhere behind the work, without hurrying it. There is comfort in knowing the sequence, because the room will not end in confusion, but in the same ordered settling it has known before. The hammers will slow, the beam will rest, the tools will return to their places, and the linen will wait through the night, holding within itself the long, patient labor of the day. Through the night, the cloth does not dream, of course, yet it seems to keep a silence full of everything done to it, as if each wooden fall had entered the weave and stayed there. The roll cools in the dark, the starch rests, the dampness travels inward and outward by degrees, and the long fibers lie closer together than they did before. When morning comes again, the room will not announce these changes loudly, but your hand will find them, because the work has taught your fingers a kind of listening. The first hour of the next day begins with a pale light that barely reaches the far wall, and the beetling frames stand with their familiar patience. You move through the room before the full power is taken up, checking the beam, the belts, the hammer faces, and the small cleared paths that let a man pass safely with cloth or tool. There is a mild, damp chill in the boards, a smell of old oil in the joints of the machines, and under it all the clean, faintly earthy scent of linen waiting. A morning inspection is never a grand event, yet it holds much of the day inside it, because things noticed early are easier to guide than things noticed late. You look for lint gathered where it might be drawn into motion, for a strap that has stiffened overnight, for a loose thread at the edge of the cloth, or for some small settling in the roll. Each discovery asks for a simple answer: a wipe, a tightening, a smoothing, a pause, and the room becomes ready not through one large act, but through many small kindnesses. The water is admitted gradually, or the drive is taken up according to the mill's arrangement, and the first motion travels through the building like a quiet decision becoming physical. Belts stir, shafts begin, a bearing complains and then settles, and the beetles lift one after another until the room's known rhythm returns around you. The first minutes are for listening, because a machine at the start of its day speaks plainly if something is wrong, and a beetler who values the cloth gives that speech his full attention. When all is well, the sound thickens into work, and thought stretches out inside it. The hammering seems to fill the air and yet leave space for the mind to move slowly, like a person walking beside a river whose noise has become familiar. You watch the roll turn, slow and sure, and the linen receives the repeated weight without protest, while the surface begins its gradual journey from woven roughness toward that close, settled, quietly shining finish. There is a steadiness in knowing that no single blow can make the cloth right, just as no single glance can judge a day's labor. The finish grows by accumulation, by return, by thousands of ordinary contacts given under the right conditions, and this truth gives the beetling room its low, patient wisdom. You can stand beside the machine for an hour and see little change, then touch the cloth later and realize that the slow work has been happening all along, beneath the noise and beneath your waiting. The younger workers sometimes ask how long a piece will take, and the answer is never only a matter of the clock. It depends on the weight of the linen, the dampness in the room, the starch in the fabric, the finish requested, and the behavior of the cloth under its first hours of beating. You may give an estimate because schedules require one, but the deeper answer remains in the hands, because the linen itself will decide some portion of the time. This is not uncertainty in the careless sense, but the living uncertainty of natural material meeting weather, machinery, and skill. A length woven from flax is not a block of iron, and even iron has its moods under heat and tool, so cloth must be approached with a certain humility. You learn not to command it like a servant, but to guide it like something with habits of its own. And this guidance becomes one of the quiet pleasures of the trade. By mid-morning, a little warmth has gathered under your collar, while your hands remain cool from touching damp places along the cloth. The contrast is familiar, almost companionable, and you no longer think it strange that a room can be warm, wet, dusty, and cold to the fingers all at once. Workplaces have their own weather, and the beetling room's weather is made of water power, starch, breath, old boards, and the steady falling of wood. Someone passes behind you carrying folded pieces from another stage, and for a moment you see the difference between cloth still under treatment and cloth already nearer to sale. The finished pieces lie with a tidier dignity, their edges squared, their faces pale and composed, while the length on your beam still seems in the middle of becoming. That middle state is where you spend your life, not at the raw beginning and not at the polished end, but in the useful patient between. There is a great deal of human life in that between, though few people speak of it. Most work is not the first invention or the final display, but the long middle making, the carrying forward, the adjustment, the repeated act that turns a rougher thing into a better one. Standing beside the beetles, you become part of that middle labor, and perhaps its comfort lies in knowing exactly where your hands belong for these few measured hours. The day's first longer pause comes when the roll must be shifted, and the silence that follows feels almost soft against the skin. You and another worker move together around the beam, loosening what must be loosened, and keeping the cloth from sagging into a crease or touching a place it should not touch. The machine waits without impatience, and in that waiting the linen's own small sounds come forward, the whisper of layers, the dull rub of damp fiber, and the faint creak of the beam. A task like this is easier when two people have worked together for some time, because fewer words are needed, and each knows what the other is likely to do. One hand steadies as the other guides, one person watches the near edge, while another watches the far, and a slight nod can replace a sentence. Such cooperation is quiet enough to be missed by visitors, yet it is one of the mill's hidden efficiencies, built not from machinery, but from familiarity. When the cloth is set again and the hammers resume, the sound feels newly arranged, as if the whole room has taken a breath and settled back into its former position. You listen for any sign that the shift has changed the pressure badly, but the notes are good, full, and even beneath the wooden heads. The young man beside you hears only that work has restarted, while you hear that it has restarted properly, and this difference is the difference between being in the room and belonging to it. The work teaches belonging slowly by giving a person the same duties until the duties no longer feel separate from the body. At first, each instruction must be remembered, each warning carried in the mind, and each motion made deliberately. But after years, the room itself seems to remind you. Your hand goes to the right place, your ear catches the changed knock, your feet avoid the worn hollow in the boards, and your eyes return, again and again, to the edge. The edge is humble, but it tells the truth. If the cloth is winding badly, the edge will confess it. If tension is wrong, the edge may lift or wander. If a wrinkle begins, the edge often gives the first sign. You follow it, not because the center is unimportant, but because order at the boundary helps protect the whole, and many quiet trades have such boundaries where care must be kept. Beyond the walls, the city has begun its own mid-morning business, with horses, hand carts, shop doors, and the movements of people whose work differs from yours but has the same plain necessity. A baker lifts loaves, a porter shoulders weight, a clerk bends over columns of figures, a woman carries washing, and somewhere a lamp from the night before is trimmed or cleaned. Cork is a city of hands, like any working place, and your beetling room is one small chamber in that larger body of labor. You may never see the linen after it leaves, but you sometimes see linen in shops or homes and find yourself judging it before you mean to. Your fingers want to know whether the finish is true, whether the weave lies close, whether the surface has been made smooth by good treatment or merely pressed into temporary neatness. It is difficult for a worker not to see the world through his work, and so even a tablecloth can become, for a moment, a quiet question. The finest pieces have a composure that seems effortless, though effort is exactly what produced it. That is one of the gentle ironies of finishing trades, that the better the work is done, the less visible the struggle behind it becomes. A badly finished cloth draws attention to its faults, while a well-finished one simply rests, and its calmness is the result of many hours of motion that have disappeared into smoothness. During dinner, when the hammers stop, you eat slowly and let your hearing return to the softer scale of ordinary life. The tea is strong and dark in the cup, the bread has a dense crumb, and the air near the doorway feels fresher than the inner part of the room. Someone speaks of a cousin looking for work, another mentions the price of coal, and another wipes lint from his sleeve with a gesture so common no one notices the habit. The talk stays practical because the day is practical, but practical talk can carry tenderness in its own plain way. Asking whether a child's cough has eased, whether a bootmaker did a fair repair, or whether a letter came from abroad may be as warm as any polished speech. People who work long hours often keep affection folded inside usefulness, and the mill's dinner pause holds those folded things quietly among bread, tin cups, and dust. After the meal, the return to sound is almost a descent into water, as the hammering closes over the smaller noises, and the room becomes itself again. The first minutes after rest can feel heavy, because the body has remembered sitting, but soon the familiar stance returns, and the hands resume their old knowledge. You attend to the cloth, and the afternoon stretches out before you, not empty, not dramatic, simply full of the same care asked again. This is where the sleepiness of the work might enter. Not careless sleep, but the drowsy depth of repetition that lets the mind soften while attention remains. The hammers fall and rise, and the roll turns so slowly that watching it can feel like watching shadow move across a floor. You do not surrender judgment because the cloth still needs you, yet the rhythm steadies the inner weather, smoothing thought almost as the beetles smooth the linen. There are marks on the wall made by years of use, dark smudges at shoulder height, pale scrapes near beams, and little old repairs where timber has been patched rather than replaced. Each mark belongs to some forgotten necessity, a moved tool, a hurried adjustment, a leaning worker, a beam carried through, and together they form an unwritten record of the room. You are not separate from that record. Each day you add to it lightly, perhaps only by polishing a handle a little more with your palm. The machinery has the same layered history. A newer bolt may sit beside an older bracket. A replaced strap may run across wheels blackened by age, and one hammer may have a slightly different face from its neighbors because it was repaired in another year. Nothing in such a room is entirely new or entirely old, because useful things are mended into continuity, carrying many dates at once, without needing to speak of them. This mended continuity suits the linen trade, which itself is a long conversation between old hand methods and newer industrial arrangements. The beetling engine mechanizes an ancient idea, yet the worker beside it still depends on hand, eye, ear, and patience in ways that an earlier cloth worker would understand. The scale has changed, the power has changed, the orders may travel farther, but the material still asks to be handled with respect. If a shaft must be stopped and examined, you wait for the motion to cease fully before reaching into any place where yesterday's confidence might become today's injury. The room's calm is not ignorance of danger, but a practiced manner of moving around it without inviting trouble. In working places, caution often looks ordinary because it has become ordinary, and the safest habits are those so deeply learned they no longer need to announce themselves. You clear lint from near a bearing and wipe the area with a rag kept for that purpose, careful not to carry oil where cloth will pass. The rag comes away marked with grey and black, and the bearing, now cleaner, seems to sit more honestly in its place. Small maintenance has its own satisfaction, because the machine responds not with gratitude, but with steadier work, which is the kind of thanks a machine can give. When the hammers begin again, one of them lands with a note that still seems a shade too dull, and you watch it through several falls before deciding whether the matter is real. Experience teaches restraint as well as action, because not every difference is a fault, and not every fault requires stopping at once. You listen, compare, wait, and finally see that the roll itself is settling as expected, and the doubtful note eases into the general rhythm. The ability to wait through uncertainty without becoming careless is one of the quietest strengths of the job. You cannot stop the whole room for every imagined worry, and you cannot ignore the small warnings that protect cloth and worker. So judgment lives between those errors. It is a narrow place, but a familiar one, and after years it feels less like anxiety than like standing with one hand lightly on the pulse of work. The afternoon light shifts again, and the cloth's surface begins to show a more definite smoothness where the beetles have done their long persuading. You lift a corner during a pause, and the linen bends with a fuller hand, less loose than before, more settled, with a sheen that travels quietly along the yarns. There is pleasure in seeing matter become itself more completely, and this pleasure needs no large audience, only a worker close enough to notice. A good finish can be felt even before it is seen, because the hand meets less roughness and more continuity across the woven face. The fabric has not become lifeless, it has become composed, holding the memory of flax, thread, loom, washing, starching, and beetling in a surface ready for use. You smooth it once, almost as one might smooth a bedsheet at home, and then let it return to the process, because sentiment must never get in the way of care. The connection between factory cloth and household cloth is always near, though the mill makes it easy to forget. Here, linen is yardage, order, beam, finish, and inspection. Elsewhere, it is pillowcase, towel, tablecloth, handkerchief, shirt front, cupboard stack, and clean covering over a loaf or tray. The same material moves from noise into quiet, from industry into intimacy, and perhaps that is why finishing it well feels like a service beyond the mill. Some pieces may go to hotels, institutions, or ships, where linen is counted, laundered, folded, and replaced with the regularity of another kind of work. Some may go into shops, where hands unfold a corner to show a customer the smoothness and weight. Some may wait in a drawer for years, becoming part of a household's stored sense of order. And none of these futures is visible in the beetling room, though each begins in the repeated fall of wood. You keep working because futures are not your immediate business and because the next visible sign is enough. The cloth lies well, the edge is true, the hammering is even, and the air, though close, is neither too dry nor too wet for what must be done. A day can be judged by such plain measures, and there is relief in measures that ask no more than faithful attention to what is directly before you. Later, a messenger brings a note about another length expected before evening, and the information settles into the order of tasks without any need for excitement. The room absorbs such changes the way cloth absorbs moisture, not instantly, but by allowing them to spread through the day's arrangement. You think of space, time, beam, and help required, and then return your eyes to the present role, because future work must wait until present work is safe. The present role has entered its final part of treatment, and you can feel the day beginning to lean toward completion. The hammers still fall with the same weight, but your attention changes, becoming more searching because the difference between almost ready and ready is sometimes narrow. You check more often, touch more carefully, and look at the surface under what light remains, letting the cloth tell you whether it has received enough time. To end too soon would leave the finish wanting, but to continue too long could harden the effect or waste hours needed elsewhere. This is why the stopping of beetling is not simply a mechanical decision, but a judgment gathered from texture, sound, appearance, instruction, and experience. You speak with the foreman or another skilled worker if needed, and together you bring the length to its proper close without ceremony, because good endings in work are usually quiet. When the machine stops for that length, the final silence feels different from a pause. There is a sense of release in the frame, in the workers, and perhaps only imagined in the cloth, which has passed from the care of the beetles toward whatever hand will receive it next. You help remove or secure the roll, protecting the finished surface from touch that is too rough, and the linen rests with a calmness that seems almost earned. Another roll may indeed arrive, but the day has not enough hours for a full beginning, so perhaps it is set ready for morning. This too is work, preparing the next start so that tomorrow will enter smoothly rather than stumble. You place what must be placed, clear what must be cleared, and leave instructions plain enough that even a tired mind at dawn will understand them, because routine is strongest when it is made kind to those who must repeat it. Evening comes with a bluish dullness at the window, and the air in the room cools first near the glass. The floor has been swept, though pale fibers still cling in corners, and the tools have gone back to the hooks and ledges where hands will find them again. The hammers rest above the empty or waiting beam, no longer voices but shapes, and the whole room seems to be holding the day's last breath. You take one final walk along the frame, not hurriedly, because the last check belongs to the work as much as the first. A strap lies properly, an oil can is capped, the cloth is protected, the path is clear, and nothing has been left where night damp or chance could make trouble. The list is not spoken, but the body knows it, moving from point to point until the room has answered yes. When you close the door, the quiet behind it is not dead quiet, because wood still settles, water still moves nearby, and the linen inside continues its unseen rest. Outside, the evening has lowered over Cork, softening the edges of chimneys, roofs, wet stones, and the slow, dark line of the water. You walk away with the day in your clothes and hands, while behind you the beetling room keeps its careful darkness, waiting for morning, waiting for motion, waiting for the next long passage of cloth beneath the patient beetles. Morning finds the room again with a grey patience, and the first light lies across the floorboards as thinly as watered milk. The waiting roll has taken the chill of the night, and when you put your hand to the linen, the cold moves into your palm with a clean, almost river-like feeling. It is a small beginning, repeated so often that it might seem ordinary, yet there is always a little attention in that first touch, because the cloth has rested, and rested cloth must be read anew. The beam is set where it was placed the evening before, and the neatness of that preparation gives the morning a kinder start. You can tell, before much work has begun, whether yesterday's closing was careful, because the tools are where the hand expects them, the path is clear, and the cloth has not been left to take a bad fold in darkness. A well-prepared morning has a different temper, quieter and steadier, as though the previous day has reached forward and laid a friendly hand on the shoulder. You check the ticket again, not because you have forgotten it, but because mills run on memory and record together. The written instruction gives the customer's need, the length, the finish, and whatever marks have followed the cloth from earlier rooms, while your own inspection gives the truth of dampness, tension, edge, and feel. Between paper and palm, the day's work takes shape, and the beetling room becomes a place where commerce, craft, and weather meet in a single roll. The power comes on slowly, and the first few movements are like a person stretching after sleep. Leather tightens, the shaft turns, the hammers lift, and the room fills again with that old, deep knocking, familiar enough to be comforting and strong enough to command respect. You listen through the first sequence, eyes on the beam, and when the notes fall evenly beneath the wooden faces, your body settles into its practiced stance. This cloth is a fine one, lighter than the heavier sheeting of yesterday, and it asks for a more delicate judgment, though the machinery is still heavy. The blows must do their work through proper moisture and time, not through brute insistence, because a fine piece can be made harsh if treated without understanding. You stand closer in thought, if not in body, following its behavior carefully as the linen begins to accept the repeated pressure and gather a restrained shine. There is a quiet difference between force and roughness, and a beetler must understand it without needing to dress the idea in fancy language. Force is the weight that does useful work when guided correctly, while roughness is force without judgment. Force that bruises, marks, or wastes what many hands have already prepared. In the beetling room, the hammers are heavy, but the intention behind them is controlled, and this gives the whole process its strange, gentle discipline. The younger man beside you watches the fine cloth with a seriousness that shows he is beginning to notice distinctions. He asks whether this piece will take long, and you answer with a small movement of your hand. Neither yes nor no, because the fabric must first show how it answers the room. A direct answer would be easier, but not truer, and many trades teach their apprentices that truthful answers often arrive slowly, through observation, correction, and time. He nods, not fully understanding yet. And that is acceptable, because understanding in a mill is rarely handed over whole. It comes through mornings of mistaken confidence, afternoons of corrected handling, and evenings when one suddenly remembers the sound of a fault before knowing how one learned it. You let him watch the edge, and after a while you point out the slight easing of the roll, the way the cloth has begun to lie more obediently. The word obedient is only a convenience, of course, because linen does not obey in any human sense. It responds to moisture, pressure, fiber, weave, starch, and handling, and the worker responds in turn, creating a relationship that looks simple only from a distance. Still, the old workshop language has room for such words, because it is easier to say the cloth is behaving than to name every condition that has brought it toward order. By the time the morning is full, the fine lint has begun to show on dark sleeves, and the air carries its soft, pale dust. The hammering presses against the walls and seems to loosen little tremors from shelves and boards, yet the cloth itself remains the calm center of the noise. You touch it during a safe pause and find that the surface is changing, not suddenly, but with the faint tightening glide that tells you the work is taking hold. A good linen finish is partly visual, partly tactile, and partly something that experienced workers can sense before they explain it. The surface should not look greasy or artificially bright, nor should it feel limp from overhandling or stiff from careless starching, but should hold a natural smoothness with enough body to serve its intended use. When the cloth approaches that state, the hand receives a kind of quiet agreement from it, and the agreement is one of the day's small rewards. The mill has many forms of time running through it at once, and the beetling room belongs to the slower kind. In another room, someone may count pieces. In an office, someone may write figures, and outside a cart may be loaded according to an hour. But the finish of linen answers less neatly to clocks. You know the schedule and you honor it, yet you also know that cloth cannot be argued into readiness by the turning of a dial. This slow time is not idle time. It is full of watching, waiting, small adjustment and accumulated effect, the kind of work that becomes visible only because someone has agreed to remain beside it for long enough. The hammers repeat, the beam turns, moisture shifts, fibers flatten, and a piece that seemed merely woven begins to take on the composed surface expected of good beetled linen. Sometimes you imagine that each blow is like a word spoken very quietly into the cloth, and the final finish is the sentence made by all of them together. No single word would explain the whole meaning, and no single impact would change the cloth enough to matter. But together they make something steady and intelligible. Perhaps this is why the sound, though loud, can become soothing after years, because it is not chaos but repeated purpose. During a pause, you lean near the window and look at the water beating faintly on the outside sill. The day has turned damp again, and the sky over Cork is a low sheet of grey without hard edge or sharp colour. This weather slows the drying, and so the cloth must be watched differently, not with worry, but with the practical patience of someone who has worked through many such mornings. The damp also deepens the smell of the room, bringing out the earthier note in the linen and the old mineral smell of stone walls. The oil in the bearings seems warmer by contrast, and the leather belts give off their own faint scent as they travel, dark and slightly bitter. All these smells become the room's atmosphere, and after enough years they join together into one remembered presence, the scent of work itself. At dinner, the rain is steady enough to hear because the hammers have stopped, and it taps on roof and sill with a delicacy almost surprising after the morning's noise. You sit with your food and listen for a while, letting the small weather sounds come near. The bread is a little dry, the tea is welcome, and the warmth of the cup eases the fingers that have spent the morning touching cold, damp cloth. Someone mentions that the river is high, and someone else says the roads beyond the city will be poor by evening. The remarks are ordinary, but they matter, because water touches every part of the day, from the mill's power to the damp in the linen, and the walk home after dark. A beetler may work indoors, yet he is never entirely removed from rain, stream, tide, and weather, because all of them lean quietly against the trade. When the meal is over, the return to hammering feels deeper than before, perhaps because the rain outside adds its own soft enclosure to the room. The fine cloth continues under the beetles, and the sound of impact seems rounder in the damp air, less sharp at the edges. You check the surface more frequently now, knowing that moisture can both help and delay the finish. And the linen answers with a slow, cool smoothness. The younger man asks if the shine will be stronger by evening, and you tell him it may, though shine alone is not the whole matter. A cloth can shine poorly, with a shallow brightness that does not hold after handling, or it can develop the deeper, quieter luster that comes when the fibers have been settled rather than merely pressed. You show him how to tilt the cloth toward the window and watch the light travel along it, not as glare, but as a muted gleam. He bends close, careful not to touch with dirty hands, and for a moment the two of you look at the same small change in silence. That silence is part of teaching, because the eye needs time to decide what it is seeing, and the mind needs time to connect sight with feel. After a while, he nods, and though he may not yet have the full judgment, he has seen one more part of the work reveal itself. There are many such moments in a life of craft, brief openings when something previously invisible becomes clear. The first time you hear a faulty belt before anyone points it out, the first time you know a cloth is too damp by smell, the first time your hand feels a crease beginning beneath the surface. Each moment adds a small stone to the foundation. No one builds a trade in a single lesson, but stone by stone, noticing by noticing, the foundation becomes firm. The afternoon goes on with rain at the windows, hammers on the beam, and the gradual darkening of clothes and boards where damp air settles. You wipe the sill once where water has crept inward, because moisture in its place is helpful, and moisture wandering toward cloth can become trouble. The act is tiny, hardly worth mentioning, yet such tiny acts fill a well-kept room, preventing the slow drift from order into neglect. A length of linen waiting nearby is covered carefully, not because it is fragile like glass, but because pale cloth records accidents with unkind clarity. Dust, oil, roof drip, a careless hand, or the mark of a boot can all enter the fabric's history, if given the chance. Protecting it is simply part of respecting the labor already spent upon it, from the field worker who pulled the flax to the weaver who set the threads in order. By late afternoon, the fine piece has begun to show the finish more clearly, and even the younger worker can sense the change without prompting. The fabric lies flatter around the beam, its surface more continuous, And when you pass a clean hand lightly over the exposed portion, there is less resistance than before. The room has done its slow work again, not all of it complete perhaps, but enough that the cloth has moved distinctly toward readiness. You do not hurry the last part. The temptation, when a piece nears completion, is to think ahead too strongly, to the removal, the next beam, the closing tasks, the walk home, but this is when attention must remain close. Many faults happen near endings, when fatigue and expectation loosen the mind, and so you keep your eyes on the edge and your ear on the beat, as carefully as you did at dawn. The rain eases as the day lowers, and a little diluted light comes through the window, grey with a hint of silver. It falls across the cloth at just the right angle, and the beetled surface shows a soft travelling brightness, modest but unmistakable. You stand beside it without speaking, because the sight is enough, and the young man sees you looking and understands that the piece has answered the day well. When the machine is stopped, the silence opens slowly, rather than all at once, as if the room needs time to remember its smaller sounds. Water drips from the roof outside, someone moves a crate beyond the wall, and the beam creaks faintly as the cloth settles after motion. You examine the linen with patient hands, not stroking it for pleasure exactly, but confirming what the light has already suggested, that the finish is even, close, and calm. The cloth will go onward, and other hands will judge it again, perhaps with stricter eyes under steadier light. That is as it should be, because good work does not resent inspection, and a trade with many stages must allow each stage its own authority. You prepare the piece for its next passage, keeping the surface clean, the folds controlled, and the edges protected, and the satisfaction of the day folds itself quietly into those motions. There is a certain humility in sending work away, especially work that has taken hours of attention and will now leave your direct care. You have done what the room allowed, what your skill required, and what the cloth could receive, and now it belongs to the next part of the process. Letting go is part of finishing too, because no worker, however careful, carries a piece all the way from seed to cupboard by himself. The next roll is not started, only set ready, because the evening has gathered too far into the room. You mark what must be remembered, check the preparation, and leave the first tasks arranged for the morning, when cooler hands and clearer light will take them up. The continuity from one day to the next is practical, but it also has a quiet, emotional shape, like placing a bookmark in a well-used book. The tools are wiped, the broom is used, the oil rag is put away where it cannot touch cloth, and the floor loses the day's loose fibers. Some lint remains, because no roomful of linen can be made perfectly bare of linen's traces, but the working paths are clean and the important surfaces protected. This is enough, and enough is a word any good worker must learn to honor, because perfection beyond use can become another kind of waste. Before leaving, you glance once more at the hammers, their wooden faces still and slightly darkened by years of service. They look plain in rest, almost crude, and yet they have given the day a finish finer than their shape would suggest. That is often true of old tools, that they appear simple until one understands the subtle work they make possible through repetition, steadiness, and the human judgment beside them. The door closes, and the damp evening receives you with the smell of rain on stone. Cork streets shine in patches where water has collected, and lamps begin to make trembling reflections in the uneven surfaces of road and gutter. The mill remains behind you, not silent exactly, because water still moves and buildings never stop entirely, but the beetling room has entered its night rest, holding linen, tools, and the day's completed rhythm. You walk carefully where the stones are slick, with the tired awareness of someone whose body has done honest work and now wants warmth. The city around you is neither grand nor gloomy in this hour, only lived in with smoke rising, doors opening, carts moving slowly, and voices softened by damp air. Every person passing seems to carry some private burden of labor, and yours is the memory of hammers falling on linen until roughness became smooth. At home, the ordinary world receives you in its plain way, with a place to hang a coat, a basin, a chair, and whatever supper the household has managed. You remove the day from your hands as far as washing can remove it, though the deeper sense of cloth and motion remains somewhere beneath the skin. When you sit, the stillness feels earned, and the quiet of the room seems to gather around you like a clean folded sheet. Later, as the house lowers towards sleep, the day arranges itself into gentler pieces. The rain, the pale cloth, the young man learning to see sheen, the careful wiping of the sill, the final smoothness under your hand, all of it loosens from effort and becomes memory. The hammers no longer sound sharply in the mind. They have become distant and slow, like something heard across water, steady enough to follow into sleep. And while you rest, the mill rests too, with its beams cooling, its belts slackened, and its linen waiting in the dark. The cloth does not know that morning will come, yet everything has been placed as though morning matters, which of course it does. In that careful readiness there is a kind of peace, the peace of tools where they belong, work paused but not abandoned, and a room prepared to begin again with patience.